The largest open-weight AI model in history is now a file you can download. 2.8 trillion parameters. Free, sitting on Hugging Face, waiting for anyone with enough hardware and enough patience to pull it. 11 days ago, Moonshot AI launched Kimi K3, and it broke their own servers. 3 days in, they stopped accepting new subscriptions because demand for the model exceeded the computing capacity they had to serve it. The most in-demand AI on the planet sold out, and they promised that on July 27th, they'd give the whole thing away. They did. So the question everyone is about to type into a search bar is the only one that matters. Can you actually run it? In the next few minutes, what actually landed and how big it is, the architecture in plain English, the honest hardware reality, including the tier you are almost certainly in, the SSD streaming path that changes the math, the benchmark caveat that should make you skeptical of every number you've seen this week, the license question that is genuinely unresolved, the ecosystem gaps, and why this still matters enormously, even if you can't run it today. Confirmed versus reported. As always, let's go. Start with what landed. The release is the native MXFP4 MXF Tensors version, and the download is roughly 594 gigabytes. Let that sit for a second. Not 594 megabytes, gigabytes, that's the sit for a second. Not 594 megabytes, gigabytes, that's the compressed release, the 4-bit one. Community requantizations in other formats, including BF16 and the GGUF format that llama.cpp uses, are expected to follow within days, which is when things get interesting for people on smaller machines. The model itself, 2.8 trillion total parameters, the first open model in the 3 trillion class. It's a mixture of experts, 896 experts, of which just 16 are active per token. Do that math, less than 2% of the model is awake at any moment. It has a 1 million token context window, native visual understanding, and it's built on something Moonshot calls Kimi Delta Attention, a hybrid linear attention mechanism, combined with attention residuals. And there's one genuinely clever engineering decision worth understanding, because it explains why a 4-bit release is the native release rather than a lossy afterthought. Most models get quantized after training. You take a full precision model and squeeze it down, and quality leaks out in the process. Moonshot did quantization-aware training instead, starting from the supervised fine-tuning stage. In plain English, the model was trained while already knowing it would live in 4-bit precision, so it learned to compensate for that error as part of learning everything else. The result is dramatically less degradation than bolting compression on at the end. And MXFP4 is natively supported by NVIDIA's Blackwell generation and AMD's MI400 accelerators. So on current hardware, this format isn't a compromise, it's the intended shape. Okay, the hardware reality. This is the section you came for, and I'm going to be completely straight with you, because a lot of coverage this week has been vague in a way that's going to waste people's weekends. You cannot run full Kimi K3 on a desktop today. Not on your laptop, not on a 4090, not on a 5090, not on two of them. 594 gigabytes of weights is not a consumer hardware problem, it's a server problem. The realistic tier for running this thing as intended is a multi-GPU machine with hundreds of gigabytes of accelerator memory. The kind of box that costs more than most cars, served through VLLM or SGLang with tensor parallelism across 8 or more GPUs. If you work somewhere with that hardware, congratulations, you now have a frontier model you fully control. If you don't, and almost nobody watching does, that's not a personal failing. That's just what the largest model ever released weighs. So let's talk about what is realistic in 3 honest tiers. Tier 1, the serious workstation. If you've got a high-memory machine, think several hundred gigabytes of unified memory or a multi-GPU rig, you'll be able to run this once the tooling stabilizes at speeds that are usable for batch work rather than chat. Tier 2. And this is where this channel lives. The expert streaming path, regular viewers know exactly where I'm going. Because K3 is a mixture of experts with only 16 of 896 experts active per token. The overwhelming majority of those 594 gigabytes is asleep at any given moment. And that is precisely the loophole that projects like Colibri exploit, keeping a small resident core in RAM and streaming the active experts off a fast SSD on demand. It's the technique that let a 744 billion parameter model run on an ordinary laptop with no GPU, and it's the most watched video on this channel for a reason. Will it work on 2.8 trillion? Honestly, it's the most interesting open question in local AI this week. The sparsity ratio here is even more extreme than GLM's, which theoretically favors streaming. The file is nearly 4 times larger, which doesn't. You'd need something like 600 gigabytes to a terabyte of fast SSD free, a lot of patience, and a tolerance for measuring speed in seconds per token rather than tokens per second. But the community is going to try this within days. And if you want the full explanation of how SSD streaming makes impossible models possible, that breakdown is linked in the corner and the description. This video is the what, that one is the how. Tier 3, everyone else, which is most of us. The honest answer for today, Use the API, wait for the community GGUF requantizations, and in the meantime, run Kimi's smaller code model, which already has downloadable weights and documented support in VLLM, SGLang, and K-transformers. That's not a consolation prize. It's a genuinely good model you can use tonight while the ecosystem catches up on the giant. And that phrase, the ecosystem catches up, deserves its own moment, because it's the least covered part of this story. Kimi Delta Attention is new. That means VLLM needs updates that incorporate KDA support before K3 serves efficiently, and here's the specific gotcha. Standard prefix caching, one of the biggest cost savers in production inference, does not map cleanly onto KDA's architecture. Moonshot has contributed a VLLM KDA prefill cache implementation to land alongside the weights, which is exactly the right move. But contributed upstream and stable in your production image are different dates. Add that the toolchain integrations everyone uses, LangChain, Llama Index, and Friends, are expected but not yet validated against K3, and one analysis put the realistic timeline plainly. Production-stable local inference is likely a fourth quarter story for most teams. Downloadable today, deployable smoothly for most people later. Now, the caveat that should reframe every benchmark you've seen this week, and I genuinely haven't seen anyone else say this clearly. Almost every K3 score circulating right now comes from Moonshot's own evaluation runs or their API-submitted results. The exceptions are the independent assessments from Artificial Analysis and Arena, which, for the record, are strong. On Artificial Analysis's Intelligence Index, K3 lands third overall at 57, behind only Fable 5 and GPT 5.6, and ahead of Opus 4.8, GPT 5.5, and Gemini's Pro Tier. That's a genuinely frontier result independently measured. But the coding leaderboard needs a much bigger asterisk. Moonshot's published coding results mix runs from different agent harnesses, their own Kimi code, plus Claude code, plus Codex, plus a minimal SWE agent. And here's why that matters. The same model on equivalent tasks can score anywhere from 10 to 26 points differently depending purely on which harness runs it. 10 to 26 points. That is larger than the gap between most of the models people are arguing about. So when you see a coding number, the honest question isn't how good is the model, it's which harness produced this and would my setup reproduce it. The good news, that argument ends now. The entire reason weights matter is that community replication requires downloading the actual model, and as of tonight, anyone can. Within a week, we'll have independent numbers run under controlled conditions by people with no incentive to flatter anyone. That is exactly what open weights are for, and it's a better reason to be excited than any launch day chart. Two more honest notes on the model's behavior, reported by early users. It shows what's been described as excessive proactiveness. In ambiguous situations, it tends to act rather than stop and ask, which is a known trait in heavily agent-trained models and something to account for if you hand it real permissions. And despite benchmark parity, the subjective experience, conversational polish, still trails Fable 5 and GPT 5.6 for a lot of people. Frontier on paper doesn't always mean frontier in feel. Now the license. Because this is genuinely unresolved and it matters more than the hype. The expectation based on how Moonshot has handled every previous release is a modified MIT license, permissive commercial use allowed. But as of the run-up to this release, the exact license had not been officially published. So rule 1 for tonight. Read the license file in the repository before you build anything commercial on it, not the tweet about the license, the file. And there's a distinction that gets blurred constantly, so let's be precise. K3 is open weight, not open source in the strict sense. Open weight means the trained parameters are downloadable and usable, which is the thing that matters for almost every practical purpose. Running it, fine-tuning it, deploying it. Open source by the formal definition would also require the training data, the training code, and a full reproduction pipeline. Moonshot has never released those and hasn't here. The full technical report itself is still pending. For most of us, that distinction changes nothing. If you work somewhere with a compliance team that requires formally open source components, it changes everything. Know which room you're in. One more practical safety note, and it's genuinely important tonight. When a release this big lands, mirrors and lookalike repositories appear within hours. Download only from the verified Moonshot organization on Hugging Face. Read the license file yourself and compare checksums where they're provided. A 594 gigabyte download from the wrong source is a bad night. So step back, why does this matter, even for the 95% of us who can't run it this week? But first, the question I keep getting asked and almost nobody answers. Why would Moonshot do this? They have a model so in demand it exhausted their own GPUs. They're reportedly around $300 million in annual recurring revenue with an IPO potentially within 6 months. Giving away your crown jewel 11 days after launch looks, on paper, insane. Except it isn't. And the logic is worth understanding, because it explains the whole open weight wave. Moonshot's serving capacity is finite. That's why they stopped taking subscribers. But if the weights are public, every cloud provider, every enterprise, and every hobbyist with hardware becomes free distribution. Other people's GPUs start running your model. Your architecture becomes the thing developers build tooling around. Your name becomes the default in a category. And when you eventually monetize through your API, your apps, your enterprise deals, or a public listing, you're monetizing a standard rather than a product. It's the same play that made a lot of open source infrastructure companies enormous, applied to frontier AI. Giving away the model to win the ecosystem is not charity. It's strategy, and this week it's working. Now, 3 reasons this matters for you. First, the gap. One respected analyst framed K3 as a watershed because frontier open-weight models are now genuinely real, and estimated that the gap between the best closed models and the best open ones has compressed from a debated 6 to 9 months down to something more like 3 to 5. Whatever the exact number, the direction is unmistakable, and this release is the clearest evidence yet. Second, control. There's a practical difference between calling an API and running weights, and it's not ideological, it's architectural. When you use any hosted model, your prompts travel to someone else's servers under someone else's jurisdiction, and that's true of every provider on Earth in every country. Self-hosting is the only configuration where that question doesn't arise at all, because nothing leaves your infrastructure. For teams with strict data handling requirements, weights, you run is not a preference. It's the only compliant shape tonight. That option exists at the frontier for the first time. Third, and this is why the temperature is so high, nobody agrees on what this means. OpenAI's head of strategic futures argued publicly that a world dominated by open-weight models could tend toward what he called full AI communism, describing that outcome as dystopian. Others see the same facts and read them as the healthiest possible outcome, capability distributed rather than concentrated in a handful of companies. Both views are held sincerely by serious people, and I'd encourage you to sit with the disagreement rather than resolve it too quickly. What isn't in dispute is the fact on the ground. As of tonight, the most powerful class of model in existence is something a person can download. So what should you actually do? If you have server-class hardware, pull it, wait for the VLLM updates, and run your own benchmarks. You're about to be one of the people generating the independent numbers everyone else cites. If you're on a workstation, watch for the community GGUF requants and the SSD-Streaming experiments. That's where your path opens. And if you're on a normal machine, use the API for now. Run the smaller Kimi code model locally, and understand that the thing you actually gain tonight isn't a model you can run, it's a permanent option that can never be revoked. The file is out there now, no policy, no pricing change, no company decision can put it back. So here's my question, and I'll pin it below. Are you downloading it? And if you are, what hardware are you attempting this on and what happened? Genuinely post your specs and your results. The first wave of real community numbers starts tonight, and I want this comment section to be part of it. If someone gets K3 streaming off an SSD, I want to hear about it before the benchmarks do. Every link, the official Moonshot repository, the hardware guidance, the benchmark sources, and the SSD streaming breakdown is in the description so you can verify every claim and try it yourself. That's the standard on this channel. If you'd rather own your AI than rent it, tonight is the biggest day that idea has ever had. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.